You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Monday, everybody. It is a good news, bad news beginning to your work week. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. We are brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. I mentioned it is good news, bad news. The good news is Ohio State is your 2018 Big Ten football champions with a 21-point, 45-24 win over Northwestern. The bad news, of course, as you probably know, is that the Buckeyes will not be going to the college football playoff because the college football selection committee is a bunch of Nazis. No, actually, the real reason is that they just are inconsistent idiots, and that is going to be the tone and source of my frustration and venting here for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Kirk and Ross will be alongside for the ride here in a little bit, and we will break down their thoughts about the college football playoff decision and also what Ohio State did on Saturday against Northwestern. So, look, you probably know if you follow me on Twitter at KYLam8, and if you're not doing that, what are you waiting for? But you probably know my frustration and my anger with the college football committee. And it isn't so much their selection. Alabama and Clemson were clearly, both in terms of eye test and merit, worthy of the number 1 and 2 selections. They passed every test you could probably ask them to play. I mean, look, Clemson didn't play anybody. They didn't beat anybody. They had a terrible schedule. But they made up for it by not just winning all their games, but by winning most of them really convincingly. They looked like a top 4 team. And Alabama, I give them a lot of credit. They struggled. Georgia gave them all they could handle. Georgia dominated that game for 3 quarters. But you know what? Alabama is like Voldemort with the Horcruxes. You have the 7 Horcruxes, and you got to destroy them all, or else his soul continues to live. And you got to kill the snake. And Georgia did not kill the snake. They didn't kill Alabama off. They let Alabama in the game. They had a chance to go up by, at one point, 17 or 21 points, and they didn't. They missed that field goal. And Tua Tagovailoa, who had a terrible game, may have lost the Heisman Trophy because he played so poorly. He goes out with the injury, and Jalen Hurts comes in, and Alabama wins the game. And I give them a lot of credit for that because they did not play well. They were dominated, but they still found a way to win. And in some ways, this game was kind of shows both ends of the spectrum. It shows why Alabama is very beatable, and it also shows why they are so good because it is tough to actually beat them. Georgia was in a position to beat them, and they didn't. So Alabama, undefeated, clearly number 1, Clemson clearly number 2. This is where the real challenge of the committee comes in because you have an undefeated Notre Dame team, did not win a conference because they don't play in a conference. They play an independent football schedule. They won all of their games. You give them credit for that. And some people would say that's enough. If you win all your games, that therefore you should be in the college football playoff. But here's what I say to that. If that were always true, then why are those same people not arguing for UCF to be in the football playoff? Because they won all of their games, right? Second straight year, UCF went undefeated. And, of course, last year, UCF claimed a national championship on their own accord. And, look, I mean, they're not the best team in the country, and they probably would not have won the national championship had they gotten in. And probably the same way this year. They're not one of the 4 best teams. But if you're going to use the argument that Notre Dame won all their games, then you've got to use it for UCF. You can't draw the arbitrary line in the sand and say, well, Notre Dame is a power conference team. Because if you begin to draw that line, if you begin to set an arbitrary mark and say, well, this team is undefeated, but they're in a power conference, this team is undefeated, but they're not, Well, then you also can't say, well, Notre Dame should be in because they're undefeated, because then you have to get into a situation where it's like, well, you've got to examine what schedule they played, who they beat. Schedules aren't created equal. And I'm not saying I have a problem with Notre Dame being in there because they won their games. I do want to give the benefit of the doubt for a team that goes undefeated. But you can't just look at this and say Notre Dame is undefeated, so they deserve to be in. I mean, they struggled with Ball State. They struggled with Vanderbilt. They struggled with a one-loss Pittsburgh. They struggled to Pittsburgh by one possession. Okay, they won that game by 7 points, and that's a team that Pittsburgh, by the way, got throttled by UCF 45-14. They got throttled by Clemson by 25 points on Saturday. This Pittsburgh team is not very good, and it's like, and then Notre Dame struggles at the end of the year to a 6-win USC team. 5-win, I think it was 5-6. They were 5-6 at the time. They struggled USC in the last game of the year, and it's not just those struggles, but then you look and you start bringing in other factors like Ohio State and Oklahoma winning their conference titles. You start looking at the eye test. Ohio State and Oklahoma, trust me, they had their issues with the eye test, but nobody thinks Notre Dame would beat Ohio State or Oklahoma on a neutral field. Because Ohio State showed at the end of the season that their best is better than Notre Dame's best. But don't stop there. Look at the fact that Ohio State had slightly better wins. They both had wins against Michigan, but Ohio State won at Penn State. They won at Michigan State. They won at TCU early in the year, in Dallas, and now that does not look like a very good win. But at the time, TCU was healthy and playing a little bit better. But let's focus more on the Ohio State-Notre Dame aspect. Ohio State beat Michigan. Notre Dame beat Michigan. Notre Dame won by 7. Ohio State won by 23, okay? Let's move on. Northwestern. Ohio State just beat Northwestern in the Big Ten title game by 21 points. That was a game that they were up 24-7 at halftime. Okay, Notre Dame was losing to Northwestern for various parts of that game. They won by 10. So that's 2 games that we have head-to-head comparison between Notre Dame and Ohio State. And Ohio State won by a combined 27 points more over those 2 teams than Notre Dame. And so you add in the conference title aspect, and suddenly you could make a very good argument for Ohio State being ahead of Notre Dame. And look, maybe it doesn't come down to that, but if you really want to keep Oklahoma in too, which, by the way, I think the case really should be made that Ohio State is more deserving than Oklahoma. Ignore the fact that Oklahoma has the 91st rated defense, which that alone, to me, is a pretty good non-starter for the Sooners. But when you look at the head-to-head comparison, Ohio State is better. I know people want to just focus on that Purdue loss, which is 1/13 of the equation, and I'm not saying it should count for only 7.5% of the equation, because I think that loss maybe should be weighted just a little bit higher than like wins over Tulane or Oregon State earlier in the year. I don't think those wins count for the same equivalent as a loss to Purdue. But that loss to Purdue should not supersede the wins against Michigan and Northwestern to end the year. Ohio State ended the year on a high note, clearly looking a top 4 type of team, okay? And then you add in the Penn State wins and the Michigan State wins. And I think you compare that to what Oklahoma did, and I think they have clearly better wins. I just don't think it's comparable. And Oklahoma's defense, for as bad as and inconsistent as Ohio State's defense was, Oklahoma's was worse. And I have a problem with just saying, well, Oklahoma's offense looks so good, we're just going to ignore the defense. But Ohio State's offense looked really good, but they're holding the defense accountable for Ohio State and not Oklahoma, and I don't like that inconsistency. But if you really want to put Oklahoma in, if you really want that dynamic offense with Kyler Murray in there, then Notre Dame is the vulnerable team. They're the team that you should be taking out. Because as much as I want to reward going undefeated, not every schedule is created equal, so you can't just say 0 losses is better than 1 loss. And that's the reason why I'm not going to be one of those people today saying, well, Georgia has 2 losses, Ohio State should be in with 1 loss over them. No, I think it's more than that. I think it's that Georgia had 2 losses, but they didn't really have any great wins. I mean, they had a couple good wins, Florida, Kentucky, but they got blown out by LSU on top of that Alabama loss. They didn't win their conference title. They had 2 losses. maybe they are one of the 4 best teams, but when you take everything into account, they didn't belong in there, which is another reason why today I'm really unhappy with the process. This process is a joke because even though it doesn't matter who number 5 and number 6 is, Rob Mullins, the chair of the committee, said on Sunday that Oklahoma, Georgia, and Ohio State were similar teams. They were comparable. His words. He explained this after the selection. He said they were similar teams. None of the 3 were unequivocally better than the other. And that is the standard by which if a team is not unequivocally better, you fall back on, is one team the conference champion? If so, they're supposed to be given preference, okay? And Rob himself said that is the reason why Oklahoma was put in the college football playoff, because they had the conference championship to fall back on where Georgia did not. Fine. But explain to me then why Georgia is number 5 and Ohio State is number 6. And you may say, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who number 5 is. It doesn't matter who number 6 is. They're not getting into the playoff. But I would argue it does matter, not directly in the result, but in the principle. Because this basically shows that this committee is flawed. They play by their own rules. They have no actual guidelines to follow, or what guidelines they do have, they're not even following. Back in 2015, you may remember, Ohio State finished 7th in the final college football playoff rankings, okay? Ohio State finished 7th at 1 loss because they did not win their conference title. Guess who his number 6 was? It was Stanford. Stanford was number 6, even though that they had 2 losses, because the justification was Stanford was put ahead of Ohio State because they had a conference title. So fast forward now to 2018, Ohio State finishes 6th with 1 loss as a conference champion, and Georgia, a 2-loss team without a conference championship, finishes number 5 ahead of Ohio State, despite the committee's admittance that they, in fact, were comparable to Ohio State. Okay, and 2017, last year, the reason, 2015, the reason why Ohio State was left out, we were told, was because even though they lost 1 time at home to a playoff team, Michigan State, and they were unequivocally one of the 4 best teams in everybody's eyes, they still got left out because no conference title. Well, guess what? In 2017, they get a conference title, and Alabama, who did not have a conference title, got in, well, because they had 1 less loss. All right, so we're changing the standard a little bit. 2018, now Ohio State has just 1 loss, not 2 losses, 1 loss as a conference champion, and guess what? Georgia is still ahead of them with 2 losses and without a conference championship. You can't make this up, folks. This is my problem. This system is broken beyond repair. This committee, these 13 individuals go in the room with no transparency, no guidance, no rules to follow. They just make up on a whim what they want out of these teams, and then they go about their day. And I'm losing my interest in college football. Honestly, when it was announced that they were going to a 14 playoff and replacing the BCS, I was thrilled. I really was. I wanted 8 teams, but I'm like, this is better than what we have. And then they said they were going to a selection committee to decide the 4 teams, and I was apprehensive. I'm like, I don't know the sound. I don't like the sound of that because subjectivity is going to come into play a little bit too much here. There's not going to be consistency. There's not going to be transparency. And it turns out it took a couple years, but that's exactly what happened. We're in a situation now where I don't trust these guys at all, these guys and gals. I just do not trust them. I don't like the results from not just from year to year, but from week to week. They are so freaking inconsistent. And it's souring me on college football because if we're putting our system in the hands of 13 people that can just subjectively make up the rules as they go, I think that is a problem. Are there answers? Yes, I think there are. And it doesn't necessarily mean go to 8 teams. I don't think that necessarily has to be the answer. That's my preference. My preference is an 8-team model, something along the lines of where we have a BCS formula. Go back to the BCS, a type of algorithm that decides this. Use the computers and maybe some human element as well if you want. Although I prefer you stick with the computers. But let the computers decide the top 5 conference champions and then the top 3 at-large bids, okay? The top 5 conference champions automatically get in, and then the top 3 at-larges get in as well. That's how I would do it. That way you have a reward for the conference championships to some degree, And then you also allow a little bit of wiggle room for the really good teams out there that didn't quite win their conference. Maybe they lost in the championship, or maybe they lost because of one loss in the regular season, whatever the case may be. I would like to see an 8-team model where you let the computers pick some variation, a combination of conference champions and the best at-larges. But it doesn't have to be 8 teams. You could stick with 4 teams and let a BCS algorithm pick this so we take out the subjectivity. But I just don't like the system. I think it needs changed. They have shown there is no rhyme or reason. They say conference championships matter, but they really don't. They have 2 years in a row, they have completely ignored the principle of conference champions getting the benefit of doubt. Notre Dame, yeah, they went undefeated, but is there really a difference between what Notre Dame did in Ohio State and Oklahoma? I don't think so. And they certainly didn't win their conference title. And you can't tell me that Notre Dame is getting rewarded because they choose independence. That's their choice. They should not get special treatment just because they choose to remain independent. I don't like the system, and you know what? Here's another problem that I have. Part of this is the Big Ten's own doing. This is the second year in a row now the Big Ten is being left out of the college football playoff. And Jim Delaney, the commissioner, who was supposed to be sticking up for his constituents, his teams, he's just sitting there and letting it happen. He was given an opportunity to politic on Saturday night for Ohio State being in the college football playoff, and he declined. He just said, no, they'll do their thing, they'll get it right. It's not my job to say anything about, who they should pick. While you have Greg Sankey out there arguing for not just one, but 2 SEC teams. Okay, he was arguing and politicking for Georgia to get in a second team, and Jim Delaney would not even go to bat for its own conference champion. This is not the Jim Delaney I remember. Jim Delaney used to be very outspoken. He used to stick up for his conference. He put this league in a position to be making all this money. And now Ohio State and the Big Ten are victims of this Southern bias. And I'm not saying that this committee is just trying to give special treatment and special advantage to the SEC teams. I don't really think that's the case per se, but I think there is an inherent bias, and I think there is a little bit. I mean, this committee is made up of 6 out of 13 who are from the South, and 4 of them having SEC ties. So there is definitely a slant towards the South, and I think that's part of it. I don't think it's a conspicuous effort to leave out the Big Ten or put the SEC in, but I think there is a bias there, and somebody needs to stick up for consistency and for a league like the Big Ten getting its teams in, because they're supposed to be equal partners at the table of this college football playoff, and right now the committee is not acting like it. And the Jim Delaney I remember would have gone to bat. He did go to bat for Ohio State in 2014, and since then he's just kind of taken the day off. He's not fighting for his teams to get into the football playoff, and this is the second year in a row that the Big Ten is being left out. It's not just about what Jim Delaney says. I don't think Jim Delaney going to bat and politicking for Ohio State would have made a difference in the playoff. But when you add this into the fact that, Ohio State beat 10 FBS opponents, which was more than Oklahoma did, and, more than Georgia did, and you add in the fact that Ohio State's opponents had more FBS wins than Notre Dame and Georgia did, you start seeing a pattern here. Ohio State was not rewarded last year for playing Oklahoma in the non-conference schedule because they lost, and Alabama, meanwhile, gets to play Furman, and this year they play the Citadel. And so Ohio State and the Big Ten teams are not being rewarded for scheduling tough. Ohio State this year, they played a tougher schedule. They played all these FBS opponents. They played power conference opponents, by the way. They beat 10 power conference opponents this year. Tulane was the only team that was not a power conference opponent. So Ohio State is not benefiting from the schedule, where you have the SEC FCS Invitational in Week 11 or Week 12 of every college football season. Ohio State is sitting there playing a Big Ten opponent, and that's because the Big Ten is challenging itself, which was very commendable just a few years ago, but now it seems kind of silly. It seems stupid. And Jim Delaney and the Ohio State and the Ohio State Conference foes and the Big Ten partners, they all have to get together and say, what are we doing here, guys? It's great that we believe in this ideal that scheduling tough will help us and reward us and make us better, but it's not. The SEC is gaming the system, and these other leagues are gaming the system, and I think it's time for Jim Delaney and the league to rethink their strategy here, because it's clearly not helping going out and playing these other power conference FBS opponents. It's just not. And the unfortunate thing is I say this, and you darn well know next year, Ohio State, which, by the way, does not play a very tough schedule, they're going to be criticized for it next year. And the first time I hear that from a media member, I'm going to lose my mind, because it's like, you can't win with these people. And that's why the system is broken. Ohio State next year could go run the table against a weaker schedule. They'll have that game at Michigan. They'll have Penn State. They'll have Michigan State. There are some tough games on the schedule, but its non-conference schedule is very weak. And so they can go run the table next year, and there's still going to be people criticizing the schedule and saying Ohio State should be left out for that reason. If they lose one game next year, even if it's close, there will be some people saying Ohio State should be left out because of a weak schedule. And it's coming, but long-term, that's the direction the Big Ten has to go, because the SEC has set that precedent. And Jim Delaney can't just sit there and be a bystander anymore. Okay, the Big Ten cannot continue to let its teams get chewed up because of a bad system. So, Jim Delaney, Ohio State, Big Ten, it's time to change your strategy, partners. It just is. The status quo is no longer working. Look, you can make a case for Ohio State being left out. I'm not saying it's a travesty. Last year, Ohio State being left out was not my main concern. It was the fact that they said Ohio State and Alabama were similar the week before, and then lo and behold, Ohio State wins against a top 4 undefeated team. Alabama does not play, and Alabama suddenly is not similar, and then they get in. This year, my issue is with the inconsistency, the logic of Oklahoma's defense being shrugged off because they're a great offense, while Ohio State's defense gets taken to task. And then my issue is with the Georgia thing, because it's based on principle, a 2-loss non-champion being ahead of Ohio State. It just goes to show there is no consistency, there is no rationale. I think the committee makes up its mind, and then they just fill in the pieces to make whatever rationale they had, they're trying to justify it, after the fact. Anyhow, it's just a strange system we have. This is not good for college football. The debate does not make college football great. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. It makes me want to hit my head against a brick wall, to be perfectly honest. So, I don't know what the answer is. Like I said, it doesn't have to be going to 8 teams necessarily. That's my preference. 8 teams is my preference. It doesn't have to go to 8 teams, but there's got to be a better system than letting these 13 individuals make up the rules as they go, because this is not ideal. This is not something we should be going through every year in college football. So let's break down more about the playoff and more what happened on Saturday with Ohio State Northwestern with Kirk and Ross.
Ross Fulton is here with his whiteboard to break down what the Buckeyes and their opponents are doing on the field. Can't see the whiteboard? Close your eyes and imagine really hard. It's time to go inside the X's and O's with Ross.
Pain heals. Chicks dig scars. Glory lasts forever.
All right, Kirk and Ross are here, and we're going to break down a little bit of what we saw Saturday night against Northwestern, but obviously the big news is Ohio State's win against Northwestern in the Big Ten title game, all for naught as far as the college football playoff is concerned. Guys, let's start with the big picture here. Ohio State, a 21-point win over Northwestern, but it's not good enough as the committee placed them number 6. Kirk, I'll start with you. What are your impressions of the weekend and what the committee did in placing Ohio State 6 behind Oklahoma and Georgia?
Well, I think it just says a lot about the Big Ten and the national reputation. I mean, obviously, I think we're still paying a penance for the Clemson game a few years ago, the Iowa game last year, and obviously the Purdue game this year. The fact that we're behind a 2-loss team that lost by 20 to LSU is kind of ridiculous. And the fact that, 2 weeks ago, Michigan was their number 3 team, and people were saying, oh, they could make a lot of noise because their defense is so great. Then we go out and hang 60 on them, and it's like everybody completely forgot about that game. I watched the same clown show that everyone else did today on ESPN, and I didn't hear that game mentioned a single time. And, I don't think obviously our defense has been poor all year, but I mean, offensively, I think we're better than Oklahoma, and I think we could score on anybody. So, it's one of those things where I don't think we can stop anybody, but I think that our passing game is as good as there is in the country right now. So, we're paying a penance for the Big Ten being bad and for the fact that, Wisconsin didn't have their shit together this year. They're preseason number 4, and I feel like if they had done their job and actually made it to the championship and had Jonathan Taylor had a year and, we would have beaten them, we would have had a lot more momentum than beating a 5-loss Northwestern team that's essentially a MAC school that lost to Akron and Duke this year. So, us winning the Big Ten is great, but we beat a team that was, like a mid-tier MAC school essentially instead of a Wisconsin or an Iowa or, a major Western power that would have given us some more cred.
Ross, I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with Kirk on the Big Ten perception and that playing a role, but if it did, what does that say about a situation where Oklahoma can suddenly become the darling despite playing basically 7-on-7 flag football? I mean, the Big 12 is certainly – the Big Ten is down from where we thought it was going to be before the season, but you can't tell me the Big Ten is worse than the Big 12, but somehow Oklahoma benefits from this league of no defense, and Ohio State gets killed for it. So if Kirk is right about that and the Big Ten's perception is hurting Ohio State, how in the heck can Oklahoma be in such a darling position?
Yeah, I think it's just more like, my problem with the committee is like they make their decision and then they post hoc try to rationalize it, and like their positions are completely contradictory and make no sense, and they ignore their guidelines. And so it's like it would just be better if they're just like, we're just going to be 12 dudes. I guess there's occasionally a woman as well in the room, and we're just going to do whatever we want to do, and you guys are going to be stuck with it. But regardless, at the end of the day, it was just basically a risk averse choices. And like if you're splitting hairs, like most years a 12-1 Big Ten champ is going to be in. It was just a weird year with 3 undefeated teams. And so, at the end of the day, it was the Purdue loss that kept them out. And I don't think anything they would have done last night was going to change that.
Kirk, I'll start with you. Would you change anything about this playoff? I've gone on a tangent about this, and there are a lot of things I would change. Not necessarily the number. For me, 8 is the preference. But I don't necessarily need to see a change with the number of teams, although, like I said, I would prefer it. But for me, this doesn't cut it. This, as Ross said, I think they're just basically making a decision and then filling in the facts around it to justify it. I just think that we need some kind of system that has actual guidelines that they have to stick to, or else come up with a BCS algorithm to rank these teams, because I just don't think that this subjectivity is cutting it for me.
I agree with you. My biggest issue with going to 8 is the fact that it's just another round of spending for all of the players' families, and it's just a complete pain in the ass, basically, because it's so expensive to get to all these games, especially with the Big Ten championship game now adding to it. But, I think 8 would be a good number to get the Power 5 conference champions guaranteed in. I think that, there'd be a little bit more excitement on Championship Saturday if there's an automatic berth at stake, because honestly, going into last night, once we knew Oklahoma, beat Texas, we knew that we really had no chance of getting in. So unless we hung 100 points on Northwestern, which, that might have done it. But, it's one of those things where I think 8 would be good, and putting an automatic berth on the line. But, there's still going to be people that have discontent at 9, 10, and 11. But, I just think that it's disconcerting when we've won the Big Ten 2 years in a row and we've been on the outside looking in, for what the real prize is. The Rose Bowl is great, but honestly, this is, the least exciting bowl game we've played in since the Gator Bowl in 2011. So, it's just one of those things where I hate that winning the conference doesn't really mean anything anymore, in my opinion.
Yeah, Ross, that's the big thing for me right there. Is I think this is year number 5 of the college football playoff, and it's let's just get rid of the pretense that conference championships matter, because now clearly they don't. So let's get rid of that and just stop pretending that it does. Am I wrong here? Do you think that we just might as well call it for what it is, that it just doesn't matter? You can put it in the principles all day long, but we're seeing it doesn't really matter.
Yep, totally agree. It does not matter. You can't even claim it does if you're going to put And maybe whatever they do at 5, 6, 7, 8 is just irrelevant, and just they have the person cleaning up the room write those down, because at the end of the day, who cares who's 5 and who's 6? But like, you can't put a 2-loss Georgia team that lost ahead of a 1-loss Big Ten team if the conference championship thing matters. I mean, again, don't like sit there and say like, oh well, these teams were all close, and then we took conference championships into account, but you obviously didn't. So. I would just get rid of the thing that bothers me is like having these pretense of having rules when you don't actually apply them.
So I'm gonna kind of flip back here to the Northwestern game a little bit, and we'll talk about that for a few minutes before we just kind of touch on the big picture. Ohio State will be playing Washington in the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all. So Ross, this defensive performance, I'll stay with you. It was interesting for me because I thought for 3 quarters the defense was lights out, and that third quarter, for whatever reason, they came out and maybe you can tell us what happened schematically, what changed that Ohio State was having so many problems in that third quarter. But I thought quarters 1, 2, and 4, the Ohio State defense played really, really well, controlled the line of scrimmage, kept everything in front outside of that 177-yard run. But I thought the defense did its job. In the third quarter, to me, was the reason that game got tight. Who knows what would have happened if it ended up being on pace that it was, where Ohio State wins by 30 or 40 points. Maybe they get in or maybe it doesn't matter. I'm not sure. But what changed in that third quarter to make this game a little tighter than it probably should have been otherwise?
Joe Clark used the term last night that Ohio State has a momentum defense, which I thought was a very good term for the defense, because basically all year you've seen this where they'll play, even against the best teams they've played against, like pretty decent defense for 2 or 3 quarters, and then they'll just have a couple drives that are just total kaput. It wasn't like Northwestern came out and did a whole lot different. They just, Ohio State last night was basically stopping the run except for the 177-yard run. And then when they got pass rush, Northwestern had no chance. But when they didn't get a pass rush, Northwestern was able to make some plays. And, Northwestern ran a ton of crossing routes. And Ohio State was trying to trade off the crossers basically within their man coverage. And they never did a very good job of it. And so they got gashed a couple of times on that in the third quarter. And, the Thorson touchdown run, I think Landers let up thinking he was going to run out of bounds and didn't want to get a penalty for a hit on the quarterback. And then, of course, Thorson used that to his advantage and ran in for the end zone. So, it was never one thing. It's just they are what they are on defense. They were decent. They could play well in stretches. Their defensive line got healthier these last couple of games, and so they were much more disruptive up front, but the pass defense just never really got fixed.
Kirk, were you surprised that they came out in the third quarter with you're up 24-7 at that point. The players don't know if they're making the playoff or not, but with a chance to really, put your foot down to the throat and end them, they came out and let Northwestern back in the game. Were you surprised that the way that they came out in that third quarter? And because both sides of the ball, it wasn't just defense, the offense, they looked really, off kilter there in the third as well. So did it surprise you that they came out without that killer instinct?
No, it's been the story of the season, and it's really been what costs us a shot at playing for the big ring is the fact that our guys, we just decide not to play hard for stretches of the season. And, we're more talented than every single team on our schedule. The only one that's even close is Michigan. But if you just look at just sheer scholarship situation, there's not a single kid on Northwestern that we offered. They get the C-listers from Ohio, and every time any of them made a play, they made sure to point that out during the broadcast. But it's just, our guys have had a huge issue with playing hard all year. Like, we don't play hard. We play lethargic and lazy, and that's an issue with our leadership and our I think our motivation just hasn't been there all year. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's because guys are worried about the NFL, or if guys are worried about staying healthy, or if guys are worried about everything in the world other than taking care of business. But it's been an issue. Like, we should never lose to a team like Purdue. We should never have teams like Minnesota hang in with us, or teams like Nebraska, or a TCU team that wasn't that great. We've just it's been ugly. Like, barely beating Maryland. It's been our biggest issue this whole year. And, when our guys actually decide to turn it on, then we kick Michigan's ass all over the field. But, that was one time the entire season. And that Northwestern team had no business being on the field with us. I mean, they lost to Akron, who went 4-8 and just fired their head coach today. I mean, that should have been a game where we should have hung 70, and we just decided not to do it. And that's going to be the story of these guys, is that I genuinely feel like, even though we won the Big Ten, that we genuinely underachieved given our talent level.
All right, so Ross, then, Kirk mentioned something that I want to ask you. So I thought it was bizarre, the play calling in this game. And Ohio State, when push comes to shove, wound up throwing for 499 yards. Dwayne Haskins in the pass game was just absolutely terrific once again. I mean, that may have been, I say it may have been as good as he's ever been, but then again, we just saw him against Michigan. So I don't know. They were his two best performances we've seen him. But the play calling in that first half, even if you set aside the fact that you got a chance to maybe make the playoff, I thought even for just trying to win the game, I thought that was a bizarre, conservative play calling effort by Ohio State, especially in the first half. I think, it picked up in spots in the second half when they needed to put the pedal to the metal. But man, I thought it was just really bizarre play calling.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was just kind of one of the more conservative, I think you used the word, efforts in terms of the play calling all season. It was even as I think I tweeted last night that Haskins bailed them out before the first half, on 3rd and 20, and somehow Northwestern's in the softest cover 4 you could ever imagine, and Terry McLaurin still gets by the corner. But otherwise they just, I feel like the staff believed Urban Meyer's own, company line about Northwestern being a tough out. And it was just they kept wanting to run the ball on the edge, and that was never there. And they kept going back to it when they could have just thrown those comeback routes that they checked to every time on 3rd down, because Northwestern's corner never got within 10 yards of a Ohio State wide receiver at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, it truly was bizarre. I mean, and the thing is, they were getting, every time that they took shot downfield, they had a receiver open. And I mean, I know that not every time they're going to get somebody to be able to get behind the defense like that, but it was successful when they went to it. So it just kind of surprised me that they didn't go to it a little more frequently. Bottom line here, Ohio State is finishing the season on a high note. They played their 2 best games of the season against Michigan and Northwestern. I mean, for all the things that Ohio State did poorly against Northwestern, they still wound up winning by 21. And outside of that third quarter, looked pretty convincing in doing it. So Ohio State's hitting in the high note here, going into the Rose Bowl against Washington. Kirk, let me just ask you: what do you expect from this Ohio State team in the Rose Bowl? And of course, we'll have several more weeks to discuss this. But do you think they're going to hit the season on a high note and pick up where they left off here at the end of the regular season?
I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is that obviously. We saw in the last game where, most people pick Washington State because, their throwing games have been so great. But, when Washington wants to, they can run the ball. I mean, they lost their stud left tackle to start the year. But, I mean, Miles Gaskin's he's a player. And it's, our issue all year has been stopping the run. I mean, it reared its head last night. We calmed down after he gave up another 70-yard run. But, even still, I worry to death about the motivation of this team just because, I know it's the Rose Bowl, but when you strip it all away, it's a meaningless bowl game that, and there's a lot of guys that are getting ready for the league and they're going to be interviewing agents and they're going to be, picking their agents and picking their training centers and debating on coming out and kind of all that nonsense that happens this time of year between, this championship weekend and bowl game, and it's a huge distraction. And when you're not playing for the big ring and you're playing for essentially a glorified 5th place trophy or 6th place trophy or whatever it is, it's not, I don't know, I worry about it. And the biggest fish obviously is Dwayne, and the pending thought is he's going to go pro. And does a guy like that, I mean, he hasn't given any inkling, but if I was him, I'd seriously wonder, is it worth playing in the game? Now, I know you'll destroy your reputation if you don't sit, but that kid's a top 10 pick. I mean, there's a lot on the line for him, and he's finished the game on fire. So would you want to risk, a bad performance and your stock going down, or do you want to, play for your teammates? This is one of those things where it's going to be real interesting leading down the stretch to play in a game that, I'm sure guys will be excited because it's a Rose Bowl and kind of all the old nostalgia. But if I was a player sitting in the seat and we didn't get into the playoffs right now, I don't know how I would get excited to play in the Rose Bowl. That's just me.
So Ross, Kirk hit on something there. I kind of wanted to ask you about anyhow. So let's assume for a second that Haskins does play. I think he will. I don't think he's given any reason to believe he'll sit out. But even if he is leaning towards going pro next year, and he plays, there are a lot of Ohio State fans saying, well, it's like kind of taking the opposite approach of the players saying, well, this game doesn't really matter. What if the coaches say, the coaches aren't saying this, by the way, and they're not going to. They're not going to say, well, this game doesn't matter. But would there be an inclination to maybe use Tate Martell a little more in this game? Because if you're Ohio State's offensive staff, if you think Haskins is leaving, you're looking to next season and maybe want to see a little bit more of him in this game. Do you think that the Ohio State coaching staff would entertain that? Not necessarily playing him every other series or anything like that, but do you think that they would want to get him more action because of that?
Honestly, I don't. I mean, I think Urban Meyer is going to want to win the Rose Bowl, and I think it's contrary to sort of his MO in general. If Haskins is going to, if let's just assume he's going to leave, and yet he's willing to play in the game, the last thing I'm going to do as a coach is to not pay off my end of the bargain and put in Tate Martell, especially because, I guess people assume that Tate Martell would start if Haskins leaves, but there's no guarantee of that. I mean, he's going to have to earn the spot. So I doubt it. I mean, if they want to use him situationally, I guess I could see that, but you'll notice they didn't play him last night either.
Yeah, they didn't. And there's a guy by the name of Matthew Baldwin, by the way, that I think is going to have something to say in the quarterback race going forward before Tate Martell is necessarily handed the job. And I'm not saying that I would bet my life on Baldwin winning next year, but I think he's going to be pretty good. So I wouldn't be shocked if he makes it a little bit of a race. But, well, we have a lot of time to talk about Ohio State, Washington, New Year's Day. Obviously, these guys, Ohio State, Washington in the Rose Bowl. Should be an interesting game. Washington's defense playing really well. They lost 3 times by a combined 20 points this year. So this is a decent Washington team, and they should give Ohio State a pretty good test. But we'll break that down over the next several weeks. Guys, I appreciate you joining me today, and we'll definitely talk more here over the next month. That's going to wrap it up for the Unscripted Ohio podcast. Sorry I did not get to any Ohio State basketball chatter. We will talk on Friday a little bit more about Ohio State. We'll catch up with Ohio State, Minnesota, as well as Ohio State, Illinois. 2 big games for Ohio State trying to bounce back this week from that loss at home to Syracuse in the Big Ten ACC Challenge. And, of course, they're going to have to go the next several weeks without Luther Muhammad, the freshman guard, who is going to be sitting out with a dislocated shoulder. There is no timetable for his return, according to Ohio State. It will depend solely on how he responds to treatment. The estimated timetables I've seen generally for a dislocated shoulder without surgery is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 weeks. So if he responds to treatment and he does not need surgery, you're probably looking at around a month time frame. But again, that is not coming specifically from Ohio State or specifically Luther's injury itself. That is just some general estimates that I have seen with my medical license from the Holiday Inn. No, actually, that's just reading WebMD in some various places. That's the estimates that I've seen, most common, 3 to 4 weeks. But we'll see. Point is, Ohio State is going to have to do it without him. They've got Minnesota, Illinois this week. Of course, they've got a neutral court game against UCLA coming up in the CBS Sports Classic later this month. And then the Big Ten will be getting in full force around January. So we'll see what Ohio State does. It just needs to hold water, keep doing what it's doing, and hopefully Luther Muhammad will be back soon. But we'll talk Ohio State basketball on Friday, and we will also start looking ahead to the matchup between Ohio State and Washington in the Rose Bowl. And later this month, we will preview Ohio State-Washington. I plan on having the SEC fan guys, Daniel and Josh, back on the show to do a simulation of Ohio State-Washington as well as the college football playoffs. And we'll also get their take on what they make of this mess. I know they're not real thrilled about the selection either. They think Ohio State actually should have been in over Notre Dame. So anyway, we got a lot of time to discuss all that. I appreciate you listening to the show today, albeit in some disappointing circumstances, we'll call it. But we'll be back on Friday. You can listen to the show every Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com. Catch us on the archives, SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. Find, follow us, rate, review us, the whole 9 yards. You can catch me on Twitter at KYLam8. We'll be back on Friday on Buckeye Grove with the next Unscripted Ohio. Have a great week, everybody.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.